Hello, this is Leonardo de Philippis, the director of Teresa. I was first introduced to Saint Teresa of Lisieux, the Little Flower, as a child, but it wasn't until I was reintroduced to her 20 years ago that I became deeply enchanted and attracted to her life. This film really came about through the inspiration of the Carmelite nuns, and particularly my wife Patty, the screenwriter, who has a very strong relationship with Teresa. The film begins with her writing her story from her sickbed in her monastery cell. Here we just get a taste of her desire to honestly tell the story of her soul. In the first major scene, when the music expands in glory and joy, which was so marvelously created by the composer, Sister Marie-Thérèse, a real Carmelite nun, I wanted to reveal the beauty and happiness of the family. Louis and Zélie Martin had 9 children, of which only 5 survived, all girls. Thérèse was the baby of the family and the apple of everyone's eye, especially her father, who always called her the Queen. This was a time in her mind of togetherness and wonderful memories that were to be vibrant all her short life. Thérèse herself loved nature and creation, and that is why I chose this pastoral setting of the French countryside. There is a freedom and an expanse of space that is filled with light and love, which is in a way the symbol of paradise, our true homeland, which is heaven. However, we quickly see the element of suffering and prediction when Thérèse looks at her mother, who at this time in real life was dying of breast cancer, and says in childhood innocence and wisdom,
"Oh, Thérèse."
Teresa, why would you say such a thing?
Because I want you to go to heaven. And you said we must die to get there.
This sets the tone for the whole story, and how she discovers the deeper meaning of these words. It was important to me that we go to Europe to shoot some of the scenes where Thérèse herself lived in France. I wanted to capture the beauty and splendor of Normandy, but also to make us feel in our imagination that we were going back in time. Therefore, I wanted the costumes and production value to support the historical period. We now jump in time to the single moment that traumatized this young girl in her life by revealing the death of her precious mother. This memory is so vivid in Theresa's mind as she tells her story. Instead of crying, her reaction became very internalized, so that no one seemed to notice her.
The fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners. There you are, my dear. Come.
To enhance this sad emotion, the cinematographer and I decided to take some of the color out of the death scene so that there was no bright, rich colors until she looks at the mother's body laying in the coffin and sees the brilliant red of the rose placed between her mother's white, delicate hands. Even here, the little Thérèse has a look to the heavens above to remind us of the eternal reality in the quick passing of this earthly life. Therese chooses her older sister Pauline during this tragic scene to become her second mother. We end this scene with an image of the little Therese and Pauline in silence in their bed at night. Shooting the river scene was memorable because the crew, cast, and I were extremely pressured because of the shooting schedule. When it came to the director's words, action, we had to create a world of peace and contemplation, of tranquility. This is what is exciting about filmmaking, because you are always working in two realities. What is significant about this scene is that Therese herself reflects upon her own existence and her acceptance of her own weaknesses in the face of her desire for perfection. We often don't take that time in our own lives to be still and to feel the presence of God, for He is always there if we are conscious or unconscious, if we believe or don't believe. We also see the bond between father and daughter.
Beautiful trail.
Oh, how generous.
Monastic life is very ancient, and there are long-held traditions. The turn where fish are placed is where the lay people would bring gifts or food. In the speak room, or the parlor, as it is called, one sees an iron grate. This symbolizes the separation of the nuns' way of life in contrast with the visitors. They live a life of prayer and sacrifice. They also wear habits and a veil to symbolize this unique charism. I have visited hundreds of monasteries, and it is important to note that nuns are really like a family. I have always treasured these moments, just as the Martin family did over 100 years ago. This also introduces to us the place the Martin sisters will make their home someday. We called this the scruple scene, or a father's mercy. There was a time in the life of the young Therese that she became very scrupulous, and she would blow things out of proportion, as young teenage daughters have a tendency to do.
You? What are these terrible sins, little one?
You really want me to tell you?
Of course.
Like,
The father, Louis, realizes this, and with such tenderness calms the fears of his beloved daughter.
much more, Popeye. I didn't pick up my clothes when Marie told me to. I just kept reading this awful novel. I think God is punishing me. I have such evil thoughts.
Now listen to me, Therese. Don't take your scruples too seriously. Confess them.
The relationship of the father and Therese was very unique. Therese always called him the saint because he was a very spiritual man. He is really a model of fatherhood that is lost in our day and age, for Therese, she has given a very strong example of noble manhood that gave her a real sense of security later in her life, that would give her strength and courage to face many of her sufferings. The deleted expanded version of this scene on this DVD will reveal this insight even more. I wanted to be very faithful to her story so that we could sincerely share her message of love to the world. In this scene, we wanted to establish this relationship with the grown-up Pauline and Therese, who would become her second mother, and whom she will call Mama through the story. Celine is her closest sister in age and was her confidant and her soulmate. Therese went to a Benedictine school in France, where she was extremely unhappy. The girls were not so kind to her, and because of her sensitive and scrupulous nature, she had a very hard time adapting. As happens in all school life, there is always someone who is different. And that person was Teresa.
Except perhaps your slave family.
It's not true. You take it back.
It is true. Everyone is laughing at you.
The natural law is that law which God has written on the heart of man. In other words, it's the means by which we discern what is
Now, in the
good and
classroom
what is evil.
scene, the nun is dressed in a different habit from the Carmelites, which is the tradition of the Benedictine order, started by St. Benedict in the middle of the first millennium
Very good.
after the birth and death of
And the
Christ.
two divisions of positive
In fact,
divine law are
we were able to shoot in an actual Benedictine school in Portland, Oregon, in the northwest part of the United States. We just had to recreate the desks and furniture and trappings to capture the French time frame
That
at
is
the end of the 1800s.
I must ask all of you, except
Teresa
to go home tonight
was a
and
very
write a
bright young
one-page
girl
paper on the difference
and did well in
between
her
divine
studies.
law and natural law.
But that does not always make you popular.
Let us pray.
Therefore, we wanted to capture that reality that happens to so many students, to where they want to leave this hostile environment at times.
Now and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In nomine Patris, et Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Class is dismissed.
Thank you so much.
It must be hard to be so perfect.
The family dancing scene was created right on the set. We rewrote the scene once we saw the organ in this Victorian mansion to reveal the closeness of the family and the togetherness that Teresa so much desired. The tender love of the sisters and the father's memory of his beloved deceased wife were the security blanket that Teresa needed at the time to keep her sanity.
What a lovely couple.
She was always, in a sense, fragile by nature and wanted to avoid the outside world, in a sense. However, eventually the concept of the family would reveal to her a great spiritual strength later in life that included the whole human family, living and deceased.
Papa, have you been
This instinct of love
You said you
would connect with people all over this planet like no saint before her, so that all world religions and even people of no faith would be drawn to her presence and spirituality.
Pauline can teach me at home. I promise I'll study so hard, Papa.
Pauline, are you sure you want to try?
It would be fun. And I know she'd be happier. And learn more, too.
Well, all right. Just as an experiment, till the end of the year.
Thank you, Papa. Thank you.
The Martin family was well-to-do, as part of the French bourgeoisie at that time,
I think I have it.
and we wanted to create the beauty of their home
Mark 10.
that was also filled with devotional images.
And they were
These
very
devotional
sure
images
that he might touch
were a
them.
constant reminder
And
in the home
disciples
of spiritual realities.
Rebuked them.
And the disciples rebuked them. But when
Now, in this
Jesus
scene, which was the first that we shot in the production schedule,
let
which
the
was no easy
children
task
come
at the
to him,
time, Therese is being homeschooled, just as the Christ was taught by his mother in Nazareth hundreds of years before. We see the beauty of her soul and her spiritual formation. Therese, throughout her whole life, contemplated the mystery of the child Jesus and the value of this littleness and simplicity, which was to shape her life. It actually is amazing how she was able to grasp and understand Scripture, which in her later years she almost had memorized major portions and understood them so well. In the scene also, I'm very struck by the costumes that Judy Newland, our costume designer, made, the detail and the beauty of these Victorian treasures that were helped to elicit the historical period at that time.
Try not to enjoy yourselves too much, you two.
We also wanted, in a real sense, after this little study scene here, in the bush house, as we called it, to establish the bond that Therese has for her older sister, Pauline.
I want to stay here with you. I might get swallowed by a quadratic equation.
She really doesn't want ever to leave or have any separation from Pauline, because she is extremely attached to her. So she has, in a sense, a premonition of separation, that Pauline may leave her.
What's on your mind?
I'm thinking about our faraway desert place, where we will always be together.
I have to finish it by
In the Martin family, it is important to note that the family was interested in the arts. In fact, Celine loved the visual arts and would eventually become famous for her photographs of Therese. We couldn't show the wealth of Therese's artistic productivity, but Celine's invitation to help her was just a taste of this reality. Pauline is returning from the monastery, which triggers in Therese the thought that Pauline will leave her. She has a premonition that her second mama will leave her, but she tries to shake this off. Despite her sensitive nature and insecurity, Therese never stopped her dialogue with God and his Blessed Mother. Her words to the Mother of God, "Make me like a little child," are very significant, because Jesus himself would say, "Unless you become like a little child, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." This became very striking to me during the premiere of this movie in Puerto Rico, where I sat next to the classmate of Albert Einstein, who was also a very talented scientist. During the movie, he had an epiphany, because he had never understood the value of Therese's life until, during the film, he was struck by the meaning of her gentle teaching of spiritual childhood. We took this plain hallway and transformed the whole look as Therese overhears her sisters talking in the other room. Pauline is with her sister Marie, sharing the decision to go to Carmel, which is the name that derives from Mount Carmel in Israel, where the prophet Elijah began an ancient community devoted to God. It is the goal of all Carmelites to reach this vision of unity with God. Therese again is deeply hurt and runs away from her sisters. However, Pauline follows along behind and gently shares her heart with Therese about this mystical desert place called Carmel.
Therese, I have found our desert place.
You found it.
Beautiful desert.
Again, the higher side of Therese surfaces for a moment, and she also desires this treasure. To end this scene, I wanted both of them not to look at each other, but to look out to the window, to the same direction.
I'm entering Carmel.
This is a famous spiritual tableau in literature and the arts. In Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante and Beatrice, his guide, are looking in unison to the same spot. So unconsciously, I wanted to communicate this inner mystery.
Yes, my
and how well the music magnificently captures this moment of looking in the same direction. The final departure of Pauline from Therese is a very impactful moment in the life of Therese. In her autobiography, years later after the fact, she remembers in her mind the very spot where Pauline left her, as you can see in this scene right now. This is the scene of her encounter with her second death, her mother's departure, and now her older sister. There's two technical challenges that we had to have for this scene. One is that we were losing light because the sun was about to set. And two, the horse and carriage had been waiting for this shoot that we almost lost them before they had to rush off to their next appointment. And yet, despite all these distractions, we were able to shoot this, even at the end with slow motion film, to evoke the strong emotions present in Therese, in order to tenderly film this important moment. It is not easy to show a glimpse of someone so beloved throughout the world as St. Therese. One has to cling to highlights in her life when you're doing a story of a biography, autobiography especially. And symbolically, all we can do, in a sense, is reveal in short scenes, months of real life, real time. As life goes on in normal fashion, Therese becomes more and more disturbed in her own mind. Memories of the past and of the future begin to cloud this young girl's thoughts, distracting her from the present moment, which is the only time we are ever given. We are now on our way to the monastery where Pauline was staying. The entire time Therese is dreading this moment. She is so torn in her heart and mind that she feels almost this great headache. In the end, she begins slowly and almost in a, not a deliberate way, but almost in a long way, to get sick. This was the last scene that we actually shot in the movie. It was dreadfully hot, about 95 degrees in the summer, in our Victorian period costume, so you can imagine. And as before, we had to rush this to finish this scene. It seems like this is part of the whole filmmaking process, especially in this particular film. Filmmaking, in a sense, is this tension between sanity and insanity. The audience has no idea the drama behind the drama. The dinner scene turned out to be a lovely scene. The cast all had to be taught the mannerisms of the times. The table had to be set a certain way, and how one ate, and how women in particular had to utilize their dresses, how they sat, for example. In fact, women had to, put their backs up a certain way, and because of the design of the dress.
Therese, it's all right. Pauline understood.
How was she? How did she look?
She looked happy and healthy. She misses you very much. Papa, what was it she said about the food?
Let me see. That she missed Victoire's roast chicken, but other than that, she was feasting on bread and cheese.
Well, I doubt if she's feasting, but she didn't seem to be starving.
When I saw her there in her habit, she looked so much older. She reminded me of your dear mother.
There is much debate in history about the sickness of Therese. It actually went on for weeks, and it was believed by some that she had had a nervous breakdown or even a mental illness at the time. Others believed she was possessed. However, she herself says in her own autobiography that she felt like she had no control, but was conscious of everything happening to her. And she attributes this terrible sickness to an attack by the devil himself. While she is helpless and the doctors could not understand her sickness, the family resorts to prayer. and intercession, to plead for mercy for this precious, precious child. Images of the devil actually did, in fact, come and appear to her in black and dark forms to attack her. Obviously, all of this terrified the family, and they begged the Mother of God to intercede, to answer their prayers. Teresa realized many years later, when she was writing, that the devil knew then that this young woman would do so much good in her short life and eternally in heaven. In the end, it would be a battle he would not win. This is a very deep reality for us to contemplate, particularly the presence of evil. The miracle scene is a very key moment in her young life. The other sisters did in fact bring the Virgin of the Smile, as it has been described by her, up to her bedroom, where she was suffering immensely. The Mother of God did indeed have pity on this little one and cured her completely. Imagine me, the director, playing the role of the father during this very intense and emotional scene, with real tears in my eyes. And then, after Teresa and I embrace, I have to say very flatly to the camera and to the crew, cut. This is a very touching moment in Teresa's existence. When she visits Pauline for the first time, I wanted to make this very, very delicate. So we had to set this up properly. Papa opens the door, and she walks in.
Yes, I'm sure I want to go in.
And she, the beautiful casting light of the great, almost like a painting. You see on the wall the portrait of St. John of the Cross in the background, who was the great saint of the Carmelites, whose spirituality she embodied and lived. During the editing process, we debated for a very long time if we should have the beautiful, inspiring music that moved the entire scene. However, we chose silence, and I'm so happy we did. Silence is a very powerful experience that God uses to communicate to us. We all want the sound of thunder in our busy lives, but it is often merely the gentle whisper of wind. The beauty and joy of silence is part of the life of the monastery, and this is part of the desert place that Pauline and Teresa are communicating to one another in the scene. As Pauline finally invites her.
My little hermit.
We, the audience, are also being invited to this peace, this joy that is beyond all earthly pleasures.
Isn't it, Pauline? Where I will meet my beloved. Yes. He is here waiting. And I will come to him.
Now, in this scene, we are reminded once again that the separation and departure are part of the daily fabric of our lives. The Papa, which we'll see very shortly in this scene, speak as the sisters are leaving. This is, of course, Leonie going off, and Leonie goes to many different convents, actually. And Marie, of course, the oldest, ends up being in the monastery with the other sisters.
I don't understand why everyone has to leave.
Papa so honestly and bluntly states the fact that children will leave the parent in the end. They will fly from the nest, as he says. This is absolutely normal and yet so difficult for all concerned. This is a very profound message that Therese will continually learn. The constant detachment from the relationships and the things of this world. To seek first the kingdom of heaven. And in this really, all our restlessness that we all have, and in this scene particularly with Therese, her own restlessness, one has to really realize that true happiness will only be found in God Himself. This is why we chose again some slow motion film to evoke this reflective moment in her state of mind. This particular scene where she falls down crying was actually taken from another scene that we had to cut, called the cleaning scene. But it helped us understand the deep felt emotions that Therese really felt.
God would have to work a little miracle for me to grow up.
The Christmas conversion
Unforgettable Christmas
is one of the most famous moments in the life of Therese.
on that night.
All those who know her well can point to this incredible yet hidden event. It took us 3 evenings to shoot this scene in the heat of July. There would always be technical difficulties that would delay the completion, and so each evening, for 3 continuous nights, we would have to reset the entire shoot. It is a small miracle, really, that we finished it. To Therese still wanted to hold on to all the attachments of her childhood. As the youngest, she was especially spoiled and pampered. Indeed, she never did any housework up to this time in her life. Thus, she seemed to cry for having cried, actually, as she said. She had such a sensitive nature. However, in her bedroom, all alone, God is to give a remarkable gift to one so young. How do you create a mystical moment on film? We tried many bells and whistles in previous edits, but in the end, we chose pure simplicity, which is the heart, really, of understanding St. Therese. For those who have an open mind, her focus on the cross and the outstretching of her arms speaks volumes. She sees the sacrifice of God for us. And a new epiphany begins. In an instant, she grew up. She changed. Most of us take a lifetime to mature and care for others more than ourselves. But she was given the grace to do this at that very moment, as a young teenager.
Celine, I'm no longer the same. I've decided not to cry. Merry Christmas, Celine.
In this scene, we see her continual and unique relationship with the child Jesus. I love that statue that we chose. The grace of this is that she sees herself as a child of God, and the conversion gives her incredible confidence and security. The love that pours out from her deep devotion and gentle spirit is what inspires her. In fact, as she would say in her own autobiography, after this moment, after this Christmas conversion, she begins to take giant steps. Imagine that, the incredible audacity of this young woman, this feeling that God loves her so much that she takes giant steps for this child Jesus.
I burned with the desire to snatch the souls of great sinners from the eternal.
Her first extraordinary giant step was the utter confidence to save a hardened sinner. The prisoner Henry Pranzini, one of the most notorious murderers in France at that time, he had killed 3 women in cold blood, and the French press and society were fascinated by him. He was a talented young man, spoke, I think, 8 languages. But here he was known to be totally unrepentant. But Therese is relentless in her quest for Pranzini. Lindsay Ounce, the actress who plays Therese, is very convincing, not only by the purity that she evokes, but her own spirit of prayer. The victory of Pranzini's change of heart has created a hurricane of events that have transpired for over 100 years after her death. Because of this daring request of God to save Pranzini, to make him her first child. In the scene where he's about to have the guillotine and to cut off his head for his execution, we really see the hope for the hopeless, the most incredible situations that people can be in, the most seemingly hopeless, really, to look to this little saint for help and counsel. That's what so many people do. Teresa seems to never deny anyone. She's always interceding for those, especially the downtrodden, those who have so many problems, but especially the most hardened of hardened hearts. Now we have a shot of Papa, and I remember in that day the roses. There wasn't enough roses, so we had to plant a lot more roses to create a beautiful, lovely rose garden, which of course he loved, and of course Teresa took on that symbol of the love for roses. We call this scene Celine's sacrifice or permission. This moment is beautifully shot by our director of photography, and the art direction and costumes are exquisite. This is the magic of filmmaking, when one can recreate the past. Here we see the intimacy of these two sisters, who cherish and love each other so deeply. They are certainly a model for all siblings, particularly in our world of fragmented and divided families. It's very unique, really, and many people will say, how can a family be so close, so devout, so spiritual, loving each other so much? But in fact, they really were a model family. They really loved one another. And that's a goal for all of us. And I think this really came from the Father's heart. In all of history, this is one of the most esteemed father-daughter relationships in family life. They really, truly had a spiritual understanding that has inspired generations. This bond was punctuated by each other's nickname as Queen and King, as Teresa would call him too, the King. But in reality, Teresa also called him the Saint. In many ways, it is her father who gave her such a deep spirituality and understanding of the mysteries of life. Her complete confidence in God as Father is formed and shaped by her temporal father. In this scene, we see the symbol of the little flower that was to become her name for millions of souls.
You're awfully young.
In Lisieux, France itself, they have the very spot where this conversation took place, to commemorate Papa's permission to allow Teresa to begin her journey to Carmel. Therefore, we wanted to recreate this little masterpiece, so to speak. What I loved about directing was to capture these moments, where in these close-ups, one sees every little facial expression, the softness of the eyes, and the gentle movements of the eyebrows, but also that little tension in the faces, trying to share the depths of their desires.
Alive in the moss. See, it still has its roots. Maybe it's destined now to live on in another soil more fertile than the moss.
Oh, Papa, thank you.
To end the scene, we see the ambitiousness of Teresa. She is willing to go to the Pope himself, if need be, and her prophecy soon will be fulfilled. Here we went to Bayeux, the town close to Lisieux, where the actual bishop had met with Teresa and her father Louis. But once we entered the room of the bishop, we were back in the United States, where we had utilized a mansion that had been a convent of Franciscan nuns for decades. But it was soon to be sold to a private university. It was to be the last religious usage of this facility, and what fitting tribute to all the nuns who had dedicated their lives to the service of the poor and the education of children. As the director, it was a challenge making the scene work. There was immense tension on the set, and the crew was exhausted after already a long day, and we still had a lot of scenes to prepare and shoot. There were multiple distractions, of course, but I had to focus everyone's attention to give their best to the scene. It is a strange thing to be the father as the actor and give directions at the same time. Yet it was marvelous fun to interact with Teresa and the bishop. One really does feel that nervousness when one is going to see someone like a bishop and the little human follies that accompany such events.
Unusual request. I shall have to get the approval of the monastery.
It is at this point that Teresa keeps her hair up also, as you notice. We wanted to show her here a change in her and a desire for maturity that all young women experience. She was a woman on a mission now, and she was not going to give up.
I'll speak to him again and see what I can do.
Thank you, Your Grace.
Don't worry. It'll be fine.
The shots in Rome add so much symbolically to the stature of this journey to Rome. In doing such a famous life, it is so difficult to not want to expand all these moments, but it is impossible to share 24 years of a life in a feature film. One can only put into the can, so to speak, impressions of a life, simple strokes of the brush. The interior meeting with Pope Leo XIII and St. Teresa was shot in a cathedral to recreate a papal chamber in the Vatican, where the actual event happened. This was very tricky because it was a huge cast for us with many, many extras, and it had to be shot between an actual public mass in the cathedral and a major musical concert that evening. So we really had to capture this moment. The audience has no idea about the story behind the story. Anyway, Teresa, with her black mantilla on her head and in her dark dress, which was the custom at that time in seeing the pontiff, breaks protocol and speaks to the Pope during his blessing.
Most Holy Father, I have a great favor to ask of you. In honor of your Jubilee, permit me to enter Carmel at the age of 15.
This conversation comes straight from her own words in the story of her soul.
Wants to enter Carmel at the age of 15.
So we were able to really capture exactly what happened, particularly in the conversation.
Holy Father, if you say yes, everyone will agree.
Mademoiselle Martin, that is quite enough.
And I certainly wanted to capture the moment when the Swiss guards had to carry her away, which ended the scene on a rather humorous note that actually happened also. At the beginning of this scene, you see Teresa reading a book. It is a book about Joan of Arc, who was the great saint and hero of France, and is actually the patron saint of France, now with Saint Teresa of Lisieux also. Therese loved her and was inspired by her life of courage and faithfulness and sacrifice. This is how she responds after the disappointments of her meetings with the bishop and the pope. This scene was almost forgotten in the production the next day. Thank God someone brought it to my attention. The beauty of doing Therese's life was to create these little simple moments that are very tender and touching. For me, it was very important that the screenplay be written by a woman and that the music also be composed by a woman to bring that feminine quality to the story. Directing these wonderful young actresses was a joy for me. They were like my own daughters in a way. And acting and directing with them made us almost like a family during the entire shoot.
Our entrance is to be delayed for 3 months until after Lent of this year.
We now have to show a change in Therese as she learns to be obedient in waiting the 3 months before she can enter the monastery. The remarkable quality about Therese is that her life is hidden in little things. I think this is why people can relate to her so well. All of us, no matter how rich or poor, young or old, have moments of little things that we don't always appreciate. We are always striving after the big way and never trusting the little way of doing things. It is not in the remarkable that God often works, but in the ordinary and normal events in our life. Therese teaches us to cherish these moments, to offer them up to God with great love. I believe that is why we love her so. There is a part in all of us that wants this to unfold. Once again, the image of the child Jesus comes into play. She will take this into the monastery and live out this image. If my memory serves me, I believe we captured this goodbye between father and daughter in 2 takes. It is a reality that it is very hard for fathers to give their daughters in marriage or to see their little darlings enter religious life. It is not that they resist so much, but it is that it is hard to see the little girl leave the nest, particularly for a father. Thus I had to make this a touching moment that would tug all hearts that enter into the story. It is not for the jaded of heart. Papa truly breaks down. He actually did, while Therese gazes at him with deep affection. The music is astounding here, and I am eternally grateful every time I witness this scene.
I love you so.
How it tugs our heart,
You know
how it moves our soul.
My heart is
I've had the privilege to screen this movie with cloistered nuns and sisters at the Vatican, and their tears are flowing. Why? Most of them remember the tearful eyes of their proud fathers.
Is so brief, my dear.
His words,
We will be together.
"Life is so brief, my dear. We will be together for all eternity," is one of the great lines in the whole movie. If we took these to heart, our lives would be profoundly changed. But the point is that Therese did indeed take them to heart. Go on, my queen. Go with my blessing. The words in Latin, Deo gratias, are heard, thanks be to God, which is an old custom in the Carmelite order. Now, for many of us, we are entering into a world that is unknown. How many of you watching this film have visited or ever been inside a monastery, especially a cloistered one? The majority of the population do not even know these monasteries exist, but in the film we want to enter into this hidden world. Her words, "I am here forever and ever," was the very thing she said.
I am here forever and ever.
Her marriage to this place was complete, and she would never abandon this bond. The cell you see is a replica of the very room that Therese lived in, Lisieux, France. Carmelites for generations have had a very stark cell with little possessions. We are also introduced to the image of the Holy Face. The nuns were awakened in those days by the clapper, as it was called, every morning to begin the preparation for prayer, in the choir room, as it was named. There would be nuns on either side of this room, with separate stalls, so that they could pray. From the camera's front angle would be where the blessed tabernacle would be, that held the consecrated bread of life that Christ had given to the world. Therese was finally able to live the life of prayer that she so long desired. Carmelites nuns pray the divine office, which is called the Liturgy of the Hours, which originally goes back to the ancient Jews and their chanting of the Psalms of David from the Holy Scriptures. When we entered the monastery, I wanted the colors to be vibrant and rich because Therese described Carmel as a beautiful garden. The scene in the cloister courtyard was all created in the midst of a busy city. Streets had to be closed to cut down the noise, but it still was a challenge. The picking of the flowers and offering them to God were a constant for Therese. The cross that you see is a replica of the real one in France, in the cloister yard, and we have often fooled those who know her life well. Much of these scenes of life in Carmel are based off the photos of Therese in her life with the other sisters at the time. People do not realize that these women not only prayed hard, they worked hard. Women in this age were not accustomed to such labors because the Victorian age demanded a world of manners that excluded many such activities. So imagine how different all of this was for Therese, and yet nothing surprised her. She was ready to embrace it all, particularly her love for the cross, for the sacrifice that he'd given for the whole world. Here we are introduced to Sister Augustine, one of the main thorns in Therese's life. It is important to note that life in a monastery is not just a fairy tale of perfection all the time. It is always in the making of perfection. Much like family life, one must learn to live in community. It is no easy task to be of one heart and one mind. God has been trying to make that happen for thousands of years, and we are still learning. This is an essential ingredient to discover. All the spiritual preparation of Therese begins to be tested. In little things, she will be refined in the fire. Therese begins her journey to learn the love that makes one sane in this world. In every community and family, there are characters that try our patience, and such was Sister Augustine. We also are introduced to her phobia of spiders. Everyone has a phobia. But as she picks up these vases, one sees a major development happen. She has to come to grips with something very important. She has to make a decision.
Sister Therese, it was very careless to break that vase. And then to hide your mistake? I must say, I'm a bit surprised.
But sister, Yes, sister. I'll try to be more careful next time.
The custom, of course, was to kneel down and kiss the floor after doing something wrong. But here in the words that you hear, the voiceover, it makes it clear what happened.
This little victory over my will cost me very much. I discovered that when I did my duty without excuses, no one noticed. But any mistakes showed up immediately.
The refectory scene is where the nuns ate their meals every day. We recreated this all in a studio according to the original photographs at the time. And I was very proud of the crew for doing that, because it's amazing how the likeness was so exact. During the meal, a nun would always read for the learning and spiritual edification of the nuns. In this instant, we are hearing the story of Joan of Arc again, the saint Teresa was so interested in. The personality of Teresa was known to be very clumsy and not very good at practical work. But each folly, each activity helped mold her into a saint. Nothing was wasted.
She was dragged from her horse and captured.
We had to show the decline of Papa in the movie because he is going to get sick, as happened in real history. We had a couple of other scenes to show his sickness, but because of time restraints, in the end, we chose one single shot that could symbolize his illness and evoke that Papa was leaving us. Teresa suffered greatly during this entire period of her father's illness. I love this scene. I love the look of this whole shot. This is how the nuns actually used to wash their clothes at that time. My wife, Patty, the screenwriter, crafted this scene, and we were very pleased with the humor and the humanness of the whole situation.
No. Hard. Like this.
How's that?
This really was a fish pond, actually, that was in front of the beautiful Benedictine monastery, not the cleanest of water. The long hallway was shot at a large monastery to give us more light and distance in the nuns' environment. I wanted the lonely walking Teresa to evoke in us her feelings of weakness. The layered voiceovers help us understand what is going on within this little hidden life.
I knew I was a very little soul.
The tenderness she shows us for the infant Jesus statue again deepens her in our understanding of this extraordinary soul.
Was enough.
Sister Augustine was not only a character in the movie, she was known on the set as the Robot Lady, but the actress herself was a character. On the set, she was constantly drinking Mountain Dew, which has a lot of caffeine for those who don't know that, which probably helped her performance to give such an edgy kind of situation there. Quality. Teresa had a fear of spiders, so I had to find this little weakness in her temperament. This odd moment brings not only the human element in her character, but a charming quality.
See that our cloisters are cleaned and swept by a child of 15. Sister, clean that away and be more careful in the future.
This is really a tableau of some of the famous photographs of the nuns at recreation. Recreation is the time, usually in their very busy schedule, when they could visit with one another, do sewing and reading, etc. Many in the convent blamed Therese for the illness of her father, because she had come to the monastery, breaking his heart. Therefore, she suffered much because of this. Her doubts about her vocation really came in a flash. Providentially, the footage on the Holy Face actually went out of focus, and then the film ran out, creating a flash. Adding the sound effects enhanced it. The Mother Prioress, Mother Marie de Gonzague, was actually a very tough lady in reality. I softened her character because we did not have the time to develop another subplot. But Mother did really love Therese, and in many ways gave permission for her to write her story that made this movie even possible to be presented.
I've suddenly realized that I have no vocation. I need to return to the world, not stay here in Carmel and do my own will. Besides, I'm no good at this life. All I do is fail at every task I attempt.
Oh, my dear child. God has not brought you here to take away your vocation.
The message is very important to understand, which we'll see in this scene. The closer you come to God, the simpler you will become.
Tomorrow is the day of your final profession. Are you happy here, my child? You may leave if you wish. But do you want to stay?
I find the life difficult, but my heart has expanded here.
Then let me tell you what I think. You, my dear, are a very simple soul. And as you grow in love, you will become even more simple. The closer you approach to God, the simpler you will become.
I don't need to grow up. I need to become more and more little and weak.
This is a very profound experience, and all of us could merit from these words of wisdom.
Now go and prepare for your profession.
Our composer, Sister Marie-Thérèse, created this beautiful choral piece based on the words of St. Therese that wonderfully lifted this solemn profession of commitment to receive the black veil. Now, the white veil signifies those who are novices in the order, beginners. They are still in training, so to speak, or they're in a long engagement before a marriage ceremony. So in a sense, this is the marriage ceremony for a lifelong commitment. The black veiling of Therese is one of the most beautiful moments in this movie. After Therese receives her new habit, she now launches with greater courage into the school of the little way. What is the little way? It is taking every moment in our lives and offering it up to God. There is nothing that is trivial or insignificant. Everything becomes an opportunity for grace. Being kind to those who do not like you, not being drawn into gossip or assisting others without ever doing it for any reward except to please God. In a way, the little way is a reminder of God's love for every single breath. In the words of Shakespeare, as you see in the scene with Sister Augustine, you need to kill them with kindness. This is the mystery of true, enduring love, in which makes relationships strong and vibrant.
Well, I suppose I could show you some beginning stitches.
Thank you, Sister. I would love that.
This movie is based off of our successful one-woman show on the life of Therese. The scene and music were so popular in the live drama that we decided to bring it into the screenplay in order to illustrate the freedom and mirth that the little way can provide in one's life. Teresa is completely herself now. There is no facades.
Be myself, a little child.
Now, be careful.
Yes, sister.
Gently, gently, you're pulling on me.
Sorry, sister. Let me try this.
That's too rough. Oh, oh.
Give me your arm.
I'm not made of wood, you know. But come on, let's go.
As she walks, the old impatient nun down the hall, we see a contrast of a simple, mundane action, taking an individual to her dinner, on one hand, but inside Teresa herself, she imagines that this moment is like an elegant dance with fine-dressed young ladies, a very formal and festive event. Of course, this confuses the old nun, and she is wondering what is going on with this unusual behavior.
You're going too fast. I have to catch my breath.
I'll be more gentle, sister. But the music I heard playing was the music in my heart, and I would not have exchanged
And yet she
humble charity to enjoy 1,000 years.
She feels, and Teresa feels, like she is helping Jesus himself, guiding this woman.
Staring at. Get moving, child.
Sorry, sister. That night, I felt such love that I could not possibly have done better had I been guiding Jesus himself.
When they both enter the refectory for dinner, there is a sense of surprise. Why would there be such a display of joy and celebration? We decided to do this because Teresa herself describes this great contrast in her autobiography. It reminds me of the charm of St. Francis of Assisi, who also was known for his holy madness, where his feet would almost start to dance at times when he spoke of God. It is an oddity that's wonderful to witness.
Thank you, Sister Therese. Thank you, my child. You're so good to this old woman.
Again, it was important to show the outside work of the sisters, to share with our audience that all their lives were not trapped within the monastery walls. They had to work and to tend to the normal duties of life. In this scene, we begin to see the effects of tuberculosis by Teresa, continual coughing. St. Augustine, whose real name in the convent of Lisieux was named Sister Teresa of St. Augustine. For our purposes, to eliminate confusion, we just renamed her Sister Augustine.
I've been looking all over for you.
Sister, it's so good to see you. Could you help me?
Her personality was such that she also irritated Teresa, but she never allowed herself in the monastery to show any disappointment or anger towards Sister Augustine. This is an amazing achievement that only God can give.
What would I have done if you hadn't come along?
Would you tell me, Sister Therese, what attracts you so much towards me? Every time I look at you, I see you smile.
I'm smiling because I'm happy to see you.
Sister Augustine always believed that Teresa liked her, and that is the reason this famous scene exists, because we learn that Sister Augustine tests her motives. It wasn't until after her death that Sister Augustine learns that Teresa had any trouble with her. I believe it was one of her surviving sisters that spilled the beans. Here we now have a transition in mood, and time has passed. There happened to be a marvelous brooding storm in France when we shot the exterior of the real monastery. We now see Papa at the end of his life, and we see the developing sickness of Teresa. The rain scene is one of my favorites. The music in this scene is the same theme from the death of her mother at the beginning of the shoot. There's a real haunting sadness in the strings. We were also able to capture the rain with slow-motion film and a flicker effect to create the mood of her weakening nature. In the hallway, she coughs up blood. When this actually happened in real life, she never told anyone. She kept this suffering to herself. Thus, in this scene, we see how she held on things into her heart, taking on this suffering for the love of others. Now, in this scene, we see the sisters talking to Papa for their last meeting.
I'm not sure.
All of them didn't know this at the time, but it was a very emotional event.
And sometimes he squeezes my hand.
We see the bond between the fathers and the daughters, particularly with Teresa. And all of them must reflect upon the passing of this earthly life and the reality of the next. In this final meeting with the sisters and Teresa, which was a very moving experience for me to film, the entire crew was very respectful and attentive, as were all the actors. There was really a silence on the set, which is unusual. All the sisters speak except Teresa. She just reacts with her silence and reflects upon the incredible moment of her last meeting with her beloved father.
It's getting very difficult. He seems to go downhill every day.
Celine, take care of your
The other sisters continue to talk of the things of this world and all their natural worries, of course. But I wanted Teresa and Papa's eyes to meet. It is a scene spoken through the eyes.
Goodbye, dear Papa. I love you.
Papa's last words are, "In heaven." And it is Teresa who seems to understand this profoundly, since she will have to follow herself shortly. In a sense, this is the meaning of this movie. It is about our journey to heaven and the gift of reflecting upon the most important part of our existence. In the quiet of her cell, Teresa breathes life into her father's words.
That mustard ton.
When Celine entered the monastery, she actually brought a camera with her, and of course the Virgin of the Smile, which was to abide now in the monastery forever. And because of this, the world is privileged to have an amazing collection, not only of the statue, but of the photographs of the real Teresa. Some of the very famous ones are those of St. Teresa as Joan of Arc, which we have recreated in this scene. The play on the life of Joan of Arc is based on a true incident. Teresa always had a great fascination for the life of this patron of France, and this theme runs subtly throughout the film. She did actually write a play on St. Joan of Arc and performed it for the community.
Wait until you see what we have planned for tonight.
Notice that the girls are wearing wigs, Carmelite nuns would cut their hair short upon entrance, and I was wondering when I saw the photos where they got the wigs. After some research, it seems that after the French Revolution, with the persecution of the church, and especially of the religious communities, monasteries in particular, would keep street clothes and wigs available for the nuns, in case they were cast out of their convents. We were able to incorporate this interesting historical detail into the film. We used the dramatic Joan of Arc scene to bring out the climax of Teresa's writings and thought.
That's much better.
Therese! Are you all right?
It must have been the smoke. I'm all right. Oh, my...
She is not actually speaking the words of St. Joan, but her own explanation of how she solved the problem of wanting to be everything in the church, a priest, a doctor, a martyr. This is the moment of her revelation, that she will be the heart of the church, that she will be love.
All are not teachers, are they? All do not have the gift of healing, do they? Yet earnestly desire the greater gifts, and I will show you a more excellent way. But now abide faith, hope, and love, these three. But the greatest of these is love.
Finally, I have rest. I understand that the body of Christ has a heart, and that this heart is burning with love. Yes, in the heart of the church, my mother, I shall be love. Thus I shall be everything, and thus my dream will be realized.
The fire in this scene is based on an historical event. During the real performance of Teresa's play, the scenery actually did catch fire, and Teresa stood immobile while the nuns rushed to put out the fire. So therefore we had to create all this confusion. After the dramatic moment of the Joan of Arc play, when Teresa actually understands what her purpose in life is, she enters into the final darkness and challenge of her life. The sisters in the community, even her own blood sisters, had no idea how ill she was because she kept up such a good front. When they finally realized how sick she is, she was already dying.
Sister, come quickly and help me with that.
Cough, please.
I love this little scene for its simplicity and understatement. Teresa contracted tuberculosis, which was very common in her day. Actually, it is believed that it was in the washing in the washing pond scene that we saw, in the washing of the laundry from the hospital, as we saw in the earlier scenes, where she is being splashed by the other nun, that Teresa caught the tuberculosis.
How long has this been going on?
Well, for the past several months, I must admit, she has had a cough. But, Doctor, I had no idea it was serious.
Sister Pauline, what we have here is a far advanced case of tuberculosis.
Oh, no. Oh, my God, have mercy. I had no idea.
My beloved.
Thank you, Doctor.
Now we have the two sisters coming together in this beautiful shot, framed so well. It's almost like you're looking at a beautiful painting. It was important for me to capture a loneliness and honesty between the two sisters. An acceptance of death is normal and inevitable, but tragic. We return now to the scene at the beginning of the film, with Therese writing down the story of her soul. We had a great deal more footage for this section, which we cut for time, because it was in this period that Therese entered into the dark night of the soul, where she stopped believing in heaven, actually, and lived completely on faith that God would not abandon her. She was really terrified of death, but no one around her knew the temptation to despair that she faced. This whole section has a dreamlike feel, because Therese describes her state of mind as a thick fog. This whole period in her life is called the trial of faith. I wanted to contrast the darkness and fog of the last scene with a light, peaceful morning. Here we see the resolution of the relationship between Therese and Sister Augustine. This relationship ended up being central to the film because of the excellent work of Samantha Kramer, the actress, who played the role of the difficult nun. She is actually transformed and softened by the unrelenting kindness of Therese, and this transformation completes the arc of her character and this subplot. Therese actually was removed from her room now and taken to the infirmary for her final illness. When Therese was dying, her blood sister sat with a notebook next to her bed and wrote down everything she said, because they knew she was very special. These fragments of her words have been compiled in a book called The Last Conversations. This scene is a compilation of the most beautiful of these conversations. By mentioning the desire for a chocolate eclair, she shows us that there is no false attachment to asceticism in her. I have often reflected on them, what it means to suffer like a little child. A little child is helpless and is not afraid to show her pain and fear. This I also find so encouraging and real. And her promise that she will send down a shower of roses is, of course, famous, because after her death, the scent of roses and actual gifts of roses
will take this joy from you. You'll see. I will send down
have been associated with her miracles, so it is important to include this in the film.
May the Lord in his love and mercy free you from all your sins.
Now here in this scene, I had to do the last anointing of Therese, which is a common custom in the church. Originally I had an actor who was doing it, but he couldn't do the role effectively, So I made a phone call right during the scene and brought in a real priest so that I could get the job done and finish the shoot for this scene. Now, in this scene, we see that she was unable to even take communion at that time because she couldn't keep down any solid food whatsoever. She was suffering so much. And this, of course, was a great, great suffering for her. This final agony now, her death scene, this is the recreation of the actual death scene as it happened. And of course, we've had to shrink it down a little bit to edit it for the audience point of view. But the nuns were all gathered around Therese praying as she suffered the excruciating death of a tubercular patient, in which the lungs are actually being destroyed. She is in fact suffocating.
Mama. Mama. Mama, I'm suffocating.
Oh, my precious.
My God. I love God. Yes, He's very good. My God will never leave me, I'm sure. He has never abandoned me. Yes, my God will never abandon me.
Lord.
She always had a sense during this entire thing, this ordeal, that God would not abandon her, even though she's still in the trial of faith, remember, this thick fog. She has no consolation for heaven or what's beyond, so the suffering is incredibly intense. She does ask at one point, "Isn't this the agony? Am I going to die?" Meaning the final agony that comes at the moment of death.
Isn't this the agony? Am I not going to die?
Yes, my poor little one. It's the agony.
At this point, death would have been a relief, but she was content to suffer forever if it was God's will. It was important to capture the miraculous contrast at the moment of her death. This moment has been historically documented and was witnessed by all the nuns. Here is this tortured body completely transformed by the sight of heaven. After complete darkness, when she could see nothing of the homeland for which she longed, but only a yawning abyss of nothingness, suddenly the veil is lifted.
My God.
And total peace and love for God triumph in her soul. What a gift this moment was for all of us, giving us confidence that heaven really exists. It was almost like no one breathed in the room when this was happening. During the entire death scene, we actually had a relic of Therese given us by the Carmelite nuns. And Lindsay, the actress, wore it during the entire shoot. And we also see the rose in her hands, which was to become the great symbol of St. Therese, and the incredible shower of roses that happened. The focus here is on the riding of St. Therese, the story of a soul, as you see on the bed, and brings us full circle to the beginning of the movie when we saw her riding in her sickbed. The theme of the movie has been a focus on heaven. And here Pauline cherishes to her heart the very book that actually she was the one who was inspired to ask Therese to write these words down. Pauline reiterates this message in heaven, the words, the final words of her father's before his death. After Therese's death, the nuns sent out her story of a soul to the Carmelite monasteries in France. And this little book spread like wildfire throughout the world. It really was true that this hidden little nun, whom even her own sisters in the convent did not realize was extraordinary, and who did so little during her life, began her mission when she entered heaven. Since then, millions of people throughout the entire world have fallen in love with her because she has worked miracles in their lives. Her spirituality has changed my life by making me realize the importance of little acts of love and of how God works through extreme weakness. He has certainly done that with me by creating this beautiful film, and I am so grateful to have Therese as a friend. And it is my prayer that God will use this movie to introduce this great saint in her little way to countless souls.